Hello everyone and welcome. In this video I'm going to talk about lab this week, where we're going to be focusing on chapter 10, which is how do you talk about the difference between good and bad science. So last week we talked about sort of the differences between pseudoscience and good science, and now we're going to talk about the difference between good solid scientific work and some sloppier or bad science there. Before you start this video and go on any further, make sure you read chapter 10 and do the reading questions on Blackboard. So in chapter 10, we start with a review of sort of the big concepts in the class so far. So there are a bunch of questions at the beginning about the validity and reliability of measures, the 3 criteria for causality, and so forth. Then we add in some new ideas that we haven't yet really talked about. And one of them has to do with wanting to know whether or not more than one study has been conducted. So we're more confident in results to the extent that multiple studies have been conducted. We want to know if results seem like they would generalize to the real world, or if they're things that seem very specific to a particular context within a lab. We need to talk about how big the sample size is when evaluating the quality of research. And then also we want to know if we're reading a primary literature article or a summary of research articles. All right, so I'm going to jump right into today's lab, and then we're going to come back to our reading. All right, so if you are not in lab, I'm going to explain to you what we're doing here. So in this lab, we are going to randomly assign people to 2 groups. And we'll just randomly assign by counting off by 2s, flipping a coin, something like that. And people will be in one of these 2 groups. One group is going to stay in the classroom, and then another group is going to go outside or maybe close their eyes so they can't see or hear what that group is doing, hopefully. Our first group is going to stand in this position for 2 minutes with their eyes closed. Right? So they're going to stand in that position for 2 minutes with their eyes closed, and then afterwards we're going to ask them to complete this questionnaire. We're going to ask them, how powerful do you feel on a scale from 1 to 4, and how confident do you feel? And then we're going to take the average of their scores for those 2 questions to get a total or an average for that measure. All right, we're going to enter that information into this Google sheet here. I can go ahead and open that up. Right? And so for each group, we're going to have their confidence rating for each person, and then they're also going to enter which group they're in. All right. Now, our second group is going to do this a little bit differently. Right? So they are going to stand in this position, right? And they're going to do it also for 2 minutes with their eyes closed. Afterwards, they're going to fill out the same survey as the other group did. And then after that, they're going to enter their scores into that Google sheet. Okay, so that's the basic experimental design for what we're working on today. All right, so you may have already noticed what this study is about today. If you've ever heard anything about power posing, and it's likely you have, because power posing became really popular a number of years ago when a researcher named Amy Cuddy gave a TED Talk on it. And the TED Talk became, I think that's the second most popular TED Talk of all time. We're not going to watch the entire TED Talk, but please click on the link in the slides. So make sure you have the slides open, click on the link, and you can watch a really quick 2-minute version of her TED Talk. There's a longer one also, but you only need the short one for the purposes of this class here. Okay. All right. I'm going to pass all this here. We don't need it for right now. Sorry. And so what we're looking at is, well, do power poses work? And we're going to go to our class activity here. And so to test this, we looked at our independent variable here was how people stood, right? Either stood in what would be considered to be a high power pose, the one where the hands were on the desk and leaning forward, or a low power pose where arms were crossed, legs were crossed, and looking down. So this was a between subject study. We randomly assigned you to the different treatment conditions. Our dependent variable is how confident or powerful you felt, and we measured that with two different variables or two different rating scales and took the average of scores on those. And our null hypothesis would be that there's no difference in the two groups in their overall rating of confidence. So if we look at our results, I'm looking at a data file here. We're looking at the confidence ratings for our two groups. So 1 is our low power group and 2 is our high power group. So our low power group had a mean confidence rating of 3.07 and the high confidence group had a mean of 3.12. Then we did a t-test to compare these two means and found that the p is 0.837 with a d of negative 0.04. So you need these numbers here in your class activity form. So make sure you get the means for the two groups, 3.07 and 3.12. You also have the standard deviations for the two groups, so 1.04 and 0.956. Okay. Your p is 0.84 and your d is negative 0.04. All right. Oops, I have two DVs there. I'm going to delete one. All right. So the question is, how strong is the evidence against the null hypothesis here? Well, it's not strong at all. Our p is 0.84, right? Our data are completely consistent with the null, that the difference we're observing between our two means is likely to be just there because of sampling error, because of chance factors. Our effect size in this case was negative 0.04, which is a very, very small negligible effect. So we have a negligible effect that does not appear to be a real difference, right? So based on what we have, our data here, there does not seem to be an impact of the power pose or the position people were in on their self-reported ratings of confidence and power and so forth. Okay. All right, our next question is, do we use blinding in today's study? So in terms of a blind study, that would mean that a single blind study would mean that the participant doesn't know which condition they were in. Double blind would be the participant and the experimenter don't know which position or which group they're in. So in this case, we had you in either a high power position or a low power position pose. And you didn't technically know if you were in a high or low power pose. We didn't tell you that. We didn't tell you what to expect. But given that this is a fairly well-known phenomena, the idea of power posing, it seems really likely that people coming into the study kind of knew what we were doing, right? Knew that we were asking you to either be in a high power or a low power pose position, right? So it's not a well-blinded study. All right, next, can we infer that we have a causal relationship in today's study? When we think about the three criteria for causality, the first thing we have to do is establish causation or covariation, and that is, do we have a relationship between the variables? And we don't. We have a very small d, right, showing no effect, no differences between them, and the p is really high, telling us that any difference we're observing is there just because of chance factors, probably. Next, we have to consider temporal precedence, and that is that the independent variable come before the dependent variable. And our answer here is, well, yeah, we did measure your confidence and power rating after we had you in that position. Okay, so we do have temporal precedence. But the last thing is, can we eliminate any alternative explanations or confounds in this study? And in this case, we did something good, right, in that we did a between subjects design, and we also randomly assigned you to those conditions. So that should reduce individual differences between our studies. Okay. But and we also, I think choosing a between subjects design is a good idea, because I think if you're in both conditions, if we tell you to do both the low power and the high power position, you'll quickly see that we're trying to see the comparison between those. So it's less likely you'll be able to tell that we're studying power posing, since we did it as a between subjects design and you weren't in both groups. But still, there's a certain, you know in the study that, that you're in a particular position, and we want to see if that has an impact on your score. We didn't give you any cover story to explain what was going on or why you were doing this. And so it was probably fairly easy for people to pick up on what the hypothesis of this study was and perhaps try to consciously or unconsciously change the results to confirm that belief. All right, so if you're not, in terms of summarizing our results, we find that, yeah, we don't have compelling evidence at all that power posing has an impact on people's self-reported power and confidence. Okay. If you are not in class today, let me delete this. If you're not in class, be sure to watch the videos, this one, but also there's another video about power posing research. There's a power posing research story that you can watch. I'm also going to talk through the basics of that video here, so either way is fine. My last question I have here is, how do you think the results would have been different if we used a different control group? Okay. So I'm going to answer this later. So we have a lot to talk about before we get to this particular question. Okay. All right, so let's go back to our slides here, and that is, do power poses work? We did one little study in lab today. It wasn't a well-controlled study. It's just to demonstrate the power posing research and sort of the types of things that people do. I want to talk about the peer-reviewed research in this area. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about today, I've borrowed extensively from this video here, and I encourage you to click on it and take a look. I believe his name is Jamie Potter, and he gives a great summary of the research on power posing. There's some newer research I want to add to it, and so I'm going to talk about that here as well. Okay, so but you can click on that video and watch it if you like. All right, so let me give you a little background here on the power posing research. The first study on this was done back in 2010 with Dana Carvey and Amy Cuddy. And what they found in this study is that they had participants in high power positions and lower power posing positions. And then they measured a bunch of different dependent variables. And what they looked at was a variety of behavioral choices like risk-taking behaviors and how people change their thoughts. But what they also looked at were changes in levels of testosterone, and they found that people with high power posing positions had higher levels of testosterone compared to lower positions. They found that decreases in cortisol, so that cortisol levels went down when people were in a high power position, and that they also felt increased power, and they were higher tolerance for risk, right? And low power posers were the opposite. And so what was really interesting about this study for people is not just that people said that, yeah, I feel more powerful now after having been in these different physical positions, but that they actually said that they found a decrease in testosterone, an increase in testosterone and a decrease in cortisol with that high power position. So it was really, I think, captured people's imagination and interest in this, was that it was not just feelings of power, but actual physiological changes. And so this led to then the big TED Talk. You may have already seen the whole thing if you watched it in the past, but there's a big, really popular TED Talk, one of the most popular of all times. All right, then moving on, after the TED Talk, in 2015, there was another study that came out. So this study in 2015 by Rain Hall and colleagues was an attempted replication. And they tried to replicate the original research by the previous researchers over here. So they were trying to replicate the research by Carney and Cuddy. Right? And by replicating, they just tried to redo the same thing that they had previously done, but that previous study, that first study, had a very small sample size, and so they wanted to replicate it and see what happened with a larger sample size. And with a large sample size, they found that it had no effect on hormone levels, so it didn't change testosterone or cortisol, and it also did not have an impact on people's financial risk-taking. They did say that they felt more powerful, but it didn't have these interesting effects on people's physiology or their actual risk-taking behaviors. It was just sort of that they said they felt more powerful, but didn't see any other impact of it there, right? All right, so after that, in 2015, we have another, this is a position paper coming out from one of the authors of the original study. This is from Carney. And here this author is making a statement where they have reviewed the previous work and all of the research that's been done. And there's been a number of studies at this point showing that they argue now that they don't actually think power posing is real. Right? So this is one of the original authors saying that based on what we now know, they now realize there were some problems with the original study, not the least of which was a small sample size. But you can click on that link to read more about it. But basically, it was a problematic study, and they no longer think that power posing has an important impact. Right. All right, continuing on. Right. Here we have another study in 2017 coming out, looking at the existing evidence and the existing evidence from all the research that's been done up until this time. Looking at, they have 33 different studies, and they find it in these 33 different studies that the data basically give an effect size of 0. And it seems very likely that the results that we're observing based on power posing are not real. Right? So in this article back in 2017, that was the conclusion. Later then, we have Cuddy and Schultz giving another reply to Simmons and Simon's son. In this paper, Cuddy and Schultz are arguing basically that, yeah, we agree that power posing doesn't really have an impact on physiological outcomes. It's not affecting testosterone or cortisol. But they do say that it is having an effect on people's self-reported feelings of power here. Right? Then most recently, in 2022, there's an article which is a meta-analysis. And a meta-analysis is where they take all previous studies done on a particular topic and summarize them quantitatively. And here they look at 88 different studies with a total of 313 different effect sizes with a total of almost 10,000 participants. And they find an effect size here of G, which is similar to D, where 0.35, which is a small effect, right? It's a small effect, but it is an effect. Right? And they find that they get the effects for self-reported behavioral dependent variables, but they're not finding anything for physiological dependent variables. So there is a small effect that seems to be occurring for self-reported feelings of power and confidence. However, they question a number of methodological issues with the studies that find this. And we're not going to go over all the details here, but some things that they notice is that they get larger effect size with within subjects designs, which is not really surprising because when you do a within subjects design, it's easier for the participants to tell what the purpose of the study is. If you do both power positions and they measure your feelings after both, you can tell that you're supposed to have different feelings after being in these two different positions. And then you have demand characteristics, where you have participant and experimenter bias, particularly possibly affecting the results. So in this case, it probably makes a lot of sense to do a between subjects design. Right? They also find that if you don't give any sort of cover story, don't explain to people, give some reason while they're in those positions, that you also find larger effects. So again, it's suggesting that people are likely to be responding to experimenter and participant bias in these self-reported outcomes there. Okay. Now, also what we point out is that we also need to understand better what an appropriate control group is. And that is that you can compare a high power pose where you're very expansive, like they often call it the Wonder Woman position, or a low power pose. Right? So a low power pose is where you're really scrunched in. But one could argue that a better control group is a neutral, like just a sitting normally position. And what we want to know is, if we find a difference, like say between high and low power, is it that the high power pose actually makes you feel more powerful? Or is it possible that the low power pose is just making you feel less powerful? So what we really need is control groups where we're looking at people in just a neutral position as well to see if there isn't a difference where it's coming from. So basically, by the time we get to 2022, we're finding that there's some flaws with the studies. If there is an effect, it's probably not a physiological effect, make people feel a little bit more powerful. Sometimes, maybe, we still need some work in this area. But note here, there's a lot of back and forth, right? This is a really interesting sort of timeline to look at. We're looking at over 2022. We're starting in 2010 with one study, right? One study which really seemed to caught the public's attention with this TED Talk. And then over the next decade, researchers continued to plug away at this, conducting 80-some studies, at least in this area. And so we finally kind of come to a conclusion currently that this doesn't seem to be an important real difference that's having big effects. There's still places to go with research on it, but it's not having the same dramatic effects that we originally thought. Right? So as time went up, research got better. It was corrected, right? Science is a self-correcting process over time. As we continue to replicate each other's work, criticize it, critique it, fix it, it progressively gets better. So it's a little disappointing to find out that that original study wasn't everything it was cracked up to be, especially since there were all these TED Talks about it, and it seems to be all over the place in popular media. But this is great science, right? The original study was done, not so great, and yeah, we wish it hadn't gone out into the popular press so early, but then researchers responded and fixed it. With bigger sample sizes and compiling results over multiple studies in peer-reviewed journals where peers are going back and doing the critiquing of this. Okay. All right. So basically, what we're looking at here is, I'm not going to go over all these questions from the reading, but when we think this gave us an opportunity to think about the importance of peer review. What's an appropriate control group? When is a between and within subject study necessary? How large is the effect size? How large is the sample size? Right? There are a lot of different things that are at play here that we had an opportunity to look at. All right, so for your group final quiz today, you're going to be investigating a question. Specifically, you're going to be looking at whether using hormonal contraceptives causes depression. All right, so that's what you're going to be doing with your activity today. I'm going to stop the video now because there's a bunch of stuff that you're going to have on Blackboard that you're going to work with for that group practice quiz. Sorry, it says group final quiz. This is the group practice quiz that you're doing there. All right, and then there'll be instructions on Blackboard for the rest of it. All right, I hope that helps, and please let us know if you have any questions.